Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Welcome back, folks. Welcome back. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Still in the first hour of this live broadcast here on Tuesday with TNT, Today's News Talk. And over to the American side of the foreign policy debate, I want to welcome onto the stage a human rights lawyer and author. His name is Dan Kovalik. He's joining us on the live link right now. I believe he is outside the U.S. Dan, it's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Patrick. Glad to be talking to you. And yes, I am way outside the United States. I'm in Moscow, Russia, on my way to the Donbass tomorrow.
First of all, Dan, I want to direct people to your recent address to the UN Security Council here, and I want to play this clip, and perhaps you give us a little bit of background on this, Dan. Tell us why you were invited. Before we play the clip, tell us why you were invited to address the United Nations recently.
Yes, I was invited by the Russian mission to the United Nations to, in many ways, counter the whole trajectory of the Security Council, which is against Russia, which blames Russia for everything. Which, by the way, I witnessed without, cutting to the chase too much. I witnessed while I was there. I mean, the Security Council is very much held captive by the West. And it occurred a day before that alleged peace summit in Switzerland, right, that Russia was excluded from. Even the Swiss, by the way, said, how do you exclude the Russians from a peace conference about Russia and Ukraine, right? It's absurd. And so that was a big reason I think they had me come to talk about the issues I was talking about, to try to just balance out what the Security Council was saying and what the Security Council was hearing.
Well, let's go ahead and roll that clip right now. This is Dan Kovalik at the UN Security Council. Go ahead and roll this video.
Mr. Daniel Kovalik.
Good afternoon, dear Excellencies. Mr. President, thank you for having me. I am appearing as an executive committee member of the U.S. Peace Council today. And we are very alarmed with what appears to be the creep towards World War III. Because you now have President Biden presenting Russia with what is known as the reverse Cuban Missile Crisis, saying that Ukraine can feel free to use Western arms, munitions, missiles to attack Russia deep within its territory. And I think the Security Council has to deal with that to maintain international peace and security and to avert a global conflagration. The next thing I want to talk about, I was shocked that I would have to talk about this, and that is that very shortly, ironically, very shortly after the West celebrated D-Day, the Biden administration announced that it would start arming the Azov Battalion in Ukraine, which is a neo-Nazi organization. How can the West and the United States in particular talk about democracy and human rights when it is arming Nazis in Ukraine? Again, I urge you, your excellencies, in the interest of maintaining international peace and security, to address this issue and to halt this support for modern-day Nazis in Europe. Thank you very much.
So, Dan, you're addressing a really important problem that has arisen. Why on earth would the United States make such an announcement when clearly there's a number of countries in the world that would be opposing this, not least of all Russia? Was it to antagonize Russia? Is this why they made this announcement, to arm a known Nazi faction within the Ukrainian military?
Yeah, well, I think, honestly, I think there's a practical reason for it, and that is that, the Ukrainian army is losing, and they don't have any more troops to recruit, really. They've been forcibly recruiting people off the street, including elderly men, pregnant women. They're out of troops. And the U.S. wants to continue this war to aggress Russia. And so it's decided, well, we're going to have to just openly arm the Azov battalion. I mean, I think that's really what it comes down to. I don't think it's a matter of doing something openly provocative. I think it's just their last resort at this point. And by the way, Patrick, I'll tell you.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Very interesting thing that I found was, first of all, and one could watch the whole Security Council meeting I was at, including my entire presentation, which is about 10 minutes. But everyone gets to respond to my comments. And so the U.S. responded, UK responded, France responded, and Ukraine responded. They're not on the Security Council, but they were invited because it involved them. Okay, I mean, everyone responded, but those are the more interesting folks who responded. First of all, no one denied the facts that I said. No one said, oh, he's lying or he's misinformed, but no one denied them. Okay, all they did is kind of give polemics about the situation. So that's one interesting thing. Particularly the fact that the U.S. didn't say, oh, we're not going to arm Azov, or they're not Nazis, okay? The U.S. didn't say anything like that. They kind of skirted over, well, they didn't kind of, they skirted over the issue, okay? And as a lawyer, I would say that if you do not respond, your silence to those sorts of very provocative claims I was making would be considered admissions. It's like if I said, Patrick, you're a murderer, and then you went on and on and on about your hobbies and never denied being a murderer. One would find that odd, right? But in any case, then the Ukrainian guy got the last word, okay? And this is my second time in front of the Security Council, and it's the same guy who appeared for Ukraine. And the guy, first of all, is a clown, which you would not be surprised to hear. He's a clown. Just the way he delivers his talk is very unprofessional, very, I would say, kind of juvenile. Again, his address was interesting in the face of my claims that the U.S. is arming Nazis in the Azov battalion, that the U.S. is trying to provoke World War III. Again, he really never addresses those issues, except to say that the Azov battalion, he did say the Azov battalion, basically they're good guys, and they are very, much an instrumental part of the Ukrainian military and have been so during this war. But he didn't deny they're Nazis. So, I mean, that's a very interesting thing. So he's basically admitting that, yes, the U.S. is going to help these people, but he's saying that's fine because the Azov battalion, they're part of us and we need them. But he never said they weren't Nazis. I mean, again, he could have just said that. He didn't even have to back it up. I mean, one would think he would at least feel compelled to say, for the record, they're not Nazis. But I mean, he didn't say that. But he did embrace them as part of the Ukrainian defense apparatus. So I thought that was the most fascinating part. Again, sometimes it's what people don't say that is the most interesting. But in this case, he did embrace them. And I think even in the mainstream U.S. press, to the extent they deal with the issue head on, most of the mainstream press would concede these folks are neo-Nazis. So he had some burden on him to say that, at least try to say that they're not Nazis, and he did not do that. So that was interesting. Actually, he spent about half of his talk talking about Joseph Stalin. I mean, I'm not kidding. Like, man, we're talking about World War III and you're talking about Joseph Stalin. I mean, again, it was very strange. I would urge anyone who's just very interested in world politics and how the Security Council works to watch that entire meeting, because you learn a lot about it. You really do.
Yeah, the USAID funded a roller coaster enemies list of Ukraine, which was I think you're probably on it, Dan. I would imagine you're on quite a few of these lists. In those types of documents, they'll have these exhaustive explanations of how people like you or me or our next guest, Daniel McAdams from the Ron Paul Institute, put out propaganda about Ukraine, and they'll even say that there are Nazi elements in Ukraine in the military. They'll deny it in these expensive think tank documents paid for by the U.S. government, published in Ukraine, put out internationally. And some media outlets will even early on were saying that it's impossible that there's a Nazi presence in Ukraine because the president Zelensky happens to be Jewish, ergo that basically precludes any existence of Nazis in Ukraine. So this is how the media have been treating it, from the beginning of this conflict. But you're right, the admissions are there if you go look for them, but it's not a popular conversation. But the United States likes to fund extremists. They like to use the most vicious extremists. In Syria, this was the case. It was okay to back the moderate rebels, and in other factions and similar conflicts. Libya, another example. And here in Ukraine, it's the same thing, that they choose to back the most extreme elements, to fund them, to arm them. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, and again, while I didn't have the time to go into it, what I would have said if I had the time is that, no one should be surprised that the U.S. is backing Nazis in Ukraine, because they've been backing, first of all, Nazis in Ukraine since the 1920s. Let's just be clear about that, in order to undermine the Soviet Union, and they continued backing them, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to undermine Russia. In fact, I would argue that without the U.S. support, the Ukrainian Nazis would be a thing of the past. They would have been eradicated under the Soviet Union, but the U.S. kept them alive, right? But it wasn't just in Ukraine. As one person said, I wish I could give that he or she credit for it, because I don't remember who said it, but it was one of the best lines I've heard, is that the U.S. did not defeat the Nazis in World War II. They absorbed them. And that's very true, right? After World War II, we know about Operation Paperclip, in which the U.S. brought over 1,100 Nazi scientists to build our rocket program. We brought over Nazis to help build our intelligence against the Soviet Union, because since the Nazis fought the Soviet Union, we thought, that'd be very helpful for our intelligence program. One of the first, if not the first, NATO commanders was a former German Nazi. And the US and UK reestablished fascism in Greece, I believe in 1967, if I'm not mistaken. The US supported Nazi regime in Argentina. And I'm not being, hyperbolic to say that it was a Nazi regime in the late 1970s, early 1980s, which, by the way, killed more Jews as a proportion of their victims than anyone else. Israel supported that regime too. So, and Israel supported South Africa to the end, apartheid South Africa till the end, as the U.S. did. Both the U.S. and Israel have supported the most right-wing extremist organizations and countries in the world, in order to defend what they at least viewed was their self-interest at any given time. As you also mentioned, and it is an honorable mention, in Syria, both the U.S. and Israel supported the ISIS groups there, including the Free Syria Army, which the U.S. claimed was moderate rebels, but they were anything but moderate. In fact, according to a 2012 Defense Intelligence Agency, U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency document, they full well knew that the folks they were supporting wanted to set up a caliphate in Syria. And when I was there in 2021, for example, I went to Malula, which is one of the last cities on earth that speaks Aramaic, the language of Jesus. It's a Christian town. And in 2000, I want to say 14 or 15, the Free Syrian Army entered that town and tried to destroy it and destroy the churches there. They kidnapped nuns. They destroyed ancient Christian relics going back to, just a few decades after Jesus. And that was the Free Syrian Army that the U.S. and Israel were backing. And by the way, the two groups that beat back the FSA there and saved that Christian town were Hezbollah and the Syrian army, which a lot of people will be surprised to hear. So, yeah, none of this should be surprising to anyone, but we have to call it out and remind people that, this is part and parcel of U.S. foreign policy. It's a very, actually, integral part of U.S. foreign policy, I would say.
And Dan, I would think a big topic of discussion at the UN level, the UN Security Council level, would be, and correct me if I'm wrong, or tell me if you've talked to anybody at that institution about this. The Ukraine launched in missile strikes or attacks deep inside Russian territory, 1,100 kilometers to be precise, hitting a early warning nuclear radar station, which has no bearing on Ukraine at all. It's too far away to have any, part in that conflict, but it's part of Russia's nuclear deterrence. And this happened more or less around the same time that the White House announced that they're going to give the green light to Ukraine to use U.S. weapons to hit targets deep inside Russia. Very alarming, Dan. Very alarming, because this has to be construed by the Russians as nuclear escalation, does it not? And how serious is this topic being taken at the UN level?
Yes, I did raise that in my remarks to the Security Council, but I don't think the Security Council itself is seriously dealing with this issue. As you mentioned, the radar systems that were attacked were systems devised under the Soviet Union to be an early warning against intercontinental ballistic missiles. Intercontinental. Well, who's going to send an intercontinental ballistic missile? No, not Ukraine. The United States. So these are to intercept or allow Russia to intercept missiles, nuclear missiles sent from the United States. As you say, it has no bearing on Ukraine's defense. So why is Ukraine doing it? The only possible, reasonable interpretation the Russians could have for this is that the U.S. is preparing a first nuclear strike against Russia, and that it wants its ICBM radar systems knocked out. Now, you talk about provocative acts. If Russia did that to us, or if a surrogate of Russia, I mentioned that this was a reverse Cuban Missile Crisis, right? If Russia were to give arms to Cuba, and Cuba were to use those arms to knock out analogous radar systems in the U.S., the U.S. would undoubtedly strike Russia. And how do we know that? Because John F. Kennedy said that's exactly what we would do. He said that during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And from the point of view of the United States, that would not be unreasonable, because, again, they would have to interpret that as an attempt at a first strike nuclear attack on the United States. And so I hope your listeners understand that what is happening right now between the U.S. and Russia, and at the U.S.'s instigation, is something we've never seen in human history. We are closer to a nuclear war now than we were during the Cuban Missile Crisis, than we were in any time in history. And as I noted in my address, by the way, another reason we are is because John F. Kennedy is not president, and no one like John F. Kennedy as president. John F. Kennedy said some very bellicose things during that time. He said that if missiles, Soviet missiles from Cuba were launched on anyone in the Americas, it would be considered a direct attack by the Soviet Union upon the United States, and the U.S. would respond by attacking the Soviet Union. Well, that's a very aggressive thing to say. But behind the scenes, he was negotiating a solution, which he did in 13 days, which included removing nuclear missiles from Turkey. which, by the way, did you know the U.S. now has nuclear weapons in Turkey and a few other European countries aimed at Russia, right? But the point is that John F. Kennedy knew that he had to negotiate a solution. He had to negotiate a way out of nuclear war. The Biden administration does not see that. They are not talking to Russia. They are not talking to Putin. They are not trying to de-escalate. They are trying to escalate. And by the way, I think that makes the Biden administration the worst administration we've ever seen since World War II. Because every president since World War II, no matter how bad they were, whether they're Nixon or Reagan or Bush, they all saw one of their main jobs, maybe their number one task, was to protect Americans from the threat of nuclear war. The Biden administration does not view their task that way. They are courting nuclear war. And that should put the fear of God in anyone, Patrick.
And this is a concern that some people are raising, Dan, but not enough. Not just in Ukraine, but in Israel, in this, what can we call it, a disaster, humanitarian disaster in Gaza right now. There's been no efforts to de-escalate, only escalate. It's been 8 months. So we're 8 months into that. We're almost 2.5 years into the Ukrainian situation. The Ukrainian situation, Dan, could have been avoided completely. I mean, there were many opportunities to avoid the action Russia eventually took. That it was very clear and explicit it had to take as their kind of responsibility to protect the people of the Donbass. This is funny. That's a doctrine that's bandied about by the United States to bomb and invade Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and the list goes on. And Russia exercises it on its own border, and it's seen as the worst transgression in history by the West. And so this has pushed us right to the brink, Dan, right now. So on that front, do you see a way out right now? Realistically, do you see a potential way out for the U.S. out of the Ukraine situation? I want to get your comments on Gaza as well.
Well, Patrick, there's always a way out, though I do think the window is closing because the U.S. is trying to close that window. But I mean, what has to happen is that the U.S. has to, first of all, I mean, as you say, this war could have been prevented. And the U.S. needs to do two things that it should have done to prevent the war, to now prevent World War III. And one, it should say, okay, Russia, Ukraine is not going to ever be part of NATO. We're never going to put missiles in Ukraine. And we're going to stop supporting Ukraine aggression against Russia. And number two, we're going to stop supporting Ukrainian aggression against their own people in the Donbass, which, depending on who you are, it's either the eastern part of Ukraine or is now part of Russia. But in any case, the government in Kiev was attacking their own people in the Donbass since 2014. And so Russia wanted those two things: keep Ukraine out of NATO and Ukraine stop attacking the people in the Donbass. If the U.S. would say that right now, all of this could end overnight. And Russia's made that clear. And again, the New York Times recently, I think in the last day or two, actually finally dealt with the peace agreement that apparently was reached between Putin and Zelensky in March of 2022. Finally, the New York Times said, well, here were the terms. And there could have been a real peace deal in 2022, which would have allowed Ukraine to keep all of its territory. And the U.S. and UK blocked that peace deal. So all the U.S. has to do is say, well, we'll support that type of peace deal. And actually talk to the Russians and actually negotiate some sort of drawdown. And they could have a summit with Russia, like we used to have all the time with Soviet leaders, right? And have nuclear arms negotiations and have peace negotiations. But again, there's no evidence that the Biden administration is doing that. In fact, Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, has affirmatively said no. There's no communication between Moscow and Washington. It's unacceptable. The two giant nuclear powers are not having negotiation. And that is clearly because the Biden administration has eschewed negotiations. Russia would be happy to have it. So yes, that could be done. That could solve the crisis. The problem is the Biden administration doesn't want to solve the crisis. And you know why I think that is, or I give you an explanation that I don't have any inside information, but my perception is the follows. Again, as bad as our presidents have been since World War II, well, before that even, but focusing since before World War II, all the presidents were willing to a lesser or greater extent to take on the military-industrial complex, to say, okay, I'll go this far, but I ain't going any farther. Again, because I don't want World War III. I believe the problem with the Biden administration, I keep calling it the Biden administration and not Joe Biden, is that Joe Biden is in no mental state to do that. He is not a commander-in-chief. He is mentally disabled. And so you have the military-industrial complex, which knows only one thing, and that's war. It wants war all the time and more of it, running amok and running our foreign policy in a way it's never done, with no one in the Oval Office to say no. And that is why we are on the verge of World War III, or at least that is my belief.
We're with Dan Kovalik, international human rights lawyer, also an author, the first author to publish a book on Russiagate. If I'm not mistaken, Dan, I think you were the first. So you
Yes.
opened the door. You opened the door in a big way on that conversation a few years ago. Dan, the issue of Israel. This situation has just, in my mind and everyone else, has gone from bad to worse. There's been multiple opportunities to hit the brakes on this over the last 8 months. It hasn't happened. I mean, we've got a clip here. Just after October 7th, you confronted U.S. Senator John Fetterman from Pennsylvania. We'll put that clip on screen, obviously without any volume. And you just describe to us this interaction here, because you posted this on your X Twitter account. But tell us what happened here, Dan.
So I had a ticket to an event that he was hosting, not for himself, but for another candidate for office, for a county chief in Allegheny County, which is where Pittsburgh is. And anyway, it was at a bar. There weren't that many people there. And again, I had a paid ticket, and I just went up to him and I said, "Hey, Senator, I voted for you. You're a good guy." And I said, "Why aren't you supporting a ceasefire in Gaza?" I said, 10,000 people died there, 5,000 are children. This is a humanitarian issue. And I said a few more words, and I was just thrown out. I mean, it was kind of incredible at this fundraiser. Again, not for him. It was a fundraiser for another candidate that he was hosting, and he never answered me. It was incredible. I mean, I'm a constituent of his who voted for him, and presumably I thought he and I were on the same page. We weren't. But he didn't even deign to respond to me. He just had me thrown out. So that's what happened.
He's one of these candidates who kind of looked like very progressive when he rolled out his campaign stall and other issues. And then when this thing happened on October 7th, in Palestine, he immediately was all in for Israel, much like most Democrats and Republicans, but definitely not like this with the Squad or anybody like this on the progressive end of the party's position on that traditionally. And it's a left-wing issue. Palestine tends to support Palestine in the same way they support the obliteration of apartheid in South Africa. But this paradigm has flipped in recent years, Dan. And why do you think that is?
With the Democrats, you mean getting out in front on this?
Yeah, I think the Democrats are almost more pro-Israeli than the Republicans in some senses. But there used to be a lot of the Democrats used to restrain Israel. Maybe that's my misconstruing the issue. I know George H.W. Bush had pushed back against Israel. George W. Bush with the settlements in Gaza, or appeared to be anyway. But generally, Republicans are very, very pro-Israel, pro-Zionist. Democrats were the kind of balancing force in the House and Senate sometimes. I just don't see that's the case anymore. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, it certainly has varied, as you say. John F. Kennedy, I think, was the last president that really tried to rein in Israel, and you saw what happened to him. Eisenhower did during the Suez Canal crisis. Reagan did in Lebanon. I would say it's certainly a bipartisan issue, but I agree, at least in Congress, the Congresses tend to be a place where the Democrats were a little less strident in their support of Israel. And now you see people like Fetterman, waving the Israeli flag at protesters. I mean, again, that's something you probably wouldn't have seen before. Why that is, it's hard to say. A lot of it's money, but both the Republicans and Democrats are getting a lot of money from AIPAC. Look, I just think they're opportunists. They see it as a winning issue for them because of the money. I mean, they just know they're going to get a lot of money and a lot of backing in a way that they can't get any other way, is the truth of it. I mean, millions and millions of dollars are going to be spent by AIPAC on this election. I guess Joe Biden has gotten more money than any politician from AIPAC. So, following the money is usually probably a good way to know about these things. But again, Fetterman isn't even like his counterpart, Senator Bob Casey, another Democrat who supports Israel, but he's kind of quiet about it. He's not going out there waving Israeli flags and provoking his own constituents. Fetterman's kind of a different breed in that way. And maybe it just is his own personality, but it's very strange what's happened to him.
If I got thrown out of a fundraiser for somebody I voted for in my own state, I would become very disenchanted in the political system at that point. Dan, do you still have any faith left in your local congressmen and senators after that? I mean, a lot of people would just be incensed. They'd either switch parties or they just go all out, declare war on that candidate in public. But it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, I have no faith in our senators, but we do have a good congresswoman. I'm very lucky to have Summer Lee as our congresswoman, who's been very good on Palestine. So, but look, in general, I'm pretty jaded about the electoral system. But there are a few decent eggs, and again, Summer Lee's one of them. But yeah, I have no time for John Fetterman anymore, or Bob Casey, or most of the Democrats. But again, I'm lucky enough to have a unique individual in Summer Lee as our congresswoman. So
Dan, do you think that this support of Israel by the United States, let's be clear, Israel wouldn't be able to wage this war against the Palestinian people, this genocide, without the United States? That became very clear with this disastrous hostage raid this past week. I mean, unbelievable, the massacre they left in tow. But the U.S. is going to pay a price internationally. The entire global South seems to be on the side of Palestine. Russia has made some very stern statements consistently since this crisis began. They seem to clearly be taking the Palestinian side from the humanitarian point of view as well. And China has even got involved in this and called, pointing out the immorality of what's going on by Israel. China used to be very agnostic on this issue. They never really wade into Middle East deep politics. So all this has changed, Dan. How expensive is this for the United States going forward as the global leader of the international community, as it were? Go ahead.
Oh, it's very costly. It's going to be very, very costly. The U.S. has lost its diplomatic power in the world. It is the whole West has. The whole West, the U.S. and Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, have lost all the respect of the world because of their support for Israel. And not only amongst countries like Russia, China, which are pretty obvious ones, and as you say, of the global South, but frankly, of the people of the West even. The people of the United States, the people of Europe, the people of Canada and Japan and New Zealand and Australia. I mean, they know what's happening because of social media. They see these videos of babies being killed every day. The West's moral authority is over. The U.S.'s moral authority is over. And what comes to mind is that interesting exchange between a reporter and Gandhi. And the reporter says, what do you think about Western values? He says, it's a good idea, suggesting, well, there really aren't any, and it's true. I mean, that's what's been exposed. I mean, and I think the U.S. empire is on its way out. It was anyway, frankly, but I think this is going to speed it up. Because the U.S. was always good. The Western governments were always good, somehow, at putting a halo over their heads, even while they were doing horrendous things, like in Korea and Vietnam and Iraq and all sorts of other places. But somehow they convinced the world they were still the good guys. Well, guess what? No one thinks we're the good guys anymore. And that is very important to maintaining hegemony in the world. And I think that hegemony will be lost.
And to that end, Dan, I hear a lot of people now they're putting this Gaza issue into context and regarding Hamas as nothing different than the Viet Cong or the South African ANC, as armed liberation struggle against imperialism, colonialism, hegemony, and all the other examples of that throughout the modern history. So that conversation is also now becoming a lot clearer to people, whereby using this term, I talked about this with another human rights lawyer last week, proscribed terrorist organization by the U.S. and its allies is not necessarily regarded as such by the rest of the world, or maybe the majority of UN General Assembly members. Hezbollah is a perfect example. France doesn't even have them prescribed as a terrorist organization, interestingly enough, UN Security Council member. So this idea that this is a war on terror, which the U.S. and Israel have said, it allows them to lift any restrictions. They can go weapons free, carte blanche, do what they want, no accountability at all. That I think has to change, because this is used to justify one of the worst war crimes that we've ever seen in our lifetimes. We've just got a minute left. Go ahead, Dan, and we're going to break at the top of the hour here.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I agree with what Norman Finkelstein, who's a descendant of Holocaust victims, said. Whatever bad things you say about Hamas, you can say 10,000 times more about Israel. I mean, Israel, they are the terrorists. When you look at the numbers of people they've killed, the number of children they've killed, the number of prisoners they've taken, really hostages, thousands, that they're torturing as we speak. And again, people are seeing this. They know we are the terror. That's the fact.
Yeah, the conversation has shifted. Dan Kovalik, International Human Rights Lawyer. Everyone follow Dan on X, Twitter, and wherever else you can find him. I think, Dan, your other social media feeds as well. You're doing great work. I really appreciate you, and especially for, representing the issues at the UN level. Amazing work. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thanks, Patrick. Really appreciate it. Look forward to next time.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is author and human rights lawyer Dan Kovalik joining us on the live link. Look, top down headlines coming up. We'll be back on the other side. We're also going to have a conversation with Daniel McAdams. Very much looking forward to this as well today. Stay tuned, folks. We'll see you in a few.